As we approach this year's Hearts Day, or St. Valentine's Day for the Christians out there, I see effigies, idols, and image of Cupid and cherubim all over, pasted over boxes of delicious chocolate, plastered over cardstock, and all over online, all over the airwaves, and even on the screen. While the cherubs are something else entirely, I think most of the modern world has forgotten the tales of Eros and his bride Psyche. They are happy to use a simple image of the old god, happy to show the golden arrows, but refuse to talk about the red or black arrows. Happy to have a smiling archer on their cards declaring their love, but they also forget the trials that Psyche had to go through for her husband. They forget that Eros isn't simply a symbol of desire. He is desire. He is the son of both love and war. Born out of wedlock, born from an affair, born because of lust. A primordial god whose siblings are death, fear, terror, harmony, longing, and avenging, whose arrows could pierce the night and even cause the heavens to fall for the earth. People also forget Psyche's part of the story entirely. They forget the mortal woman who was so beautiful that mortals would pray to her and give her tribute over the goddess of love. They forget the princess who was fated to fall for a beast so terrible that all of the gods of the heavens and all the demons of hell fear this beast. They forget the mortal woman who found her wings in pursuit of her love, one of the only mortals to ever travel to the underworld in pursuit of her love, and to return. A mortal whose love for Eros was strong enough to reward herself with immortality and divinity. A tale I think the Seven Cities needs to remember this Hearts Day, especially with the reminder that the Ragnarok Games are coming for us all. Psyche was once a princess of a kingdom that bordered the Central Sea. Even though she was youngest of three sisters, she was the youngest, she was considered the most beautiful in all of her kingdom. Her eldest sister, Cleo, caught the eye of the pharaoh of Kemet, whom she married, and she soon found herself in charge of her husband's armies, securing glory for both Kemet and her parents' kingdom. Thalia, the middle child, who studied poetry, and through poetry fell in love with a Roman senator. Through her marriage to the senator, she secured writings from all over the known world and beyond. She lived a happy life, increasing the knowledge and the writings of her kingdom, and that of the Roman Republic. And then there was Psyche. Even though she didn't have her sister's talents in warfare nor words, her beauty was said to be so great that people of her kingdom stopped leaving prayers, tribute, and worship for Aphrodite and started praying to Psyche, started leaving their tribute to her and worshipping her, bowing wherever she traveled, covering their eyes and hopeful to catch even a glance of her beauty in the puddles of the streets. This further strengthened the king's power, who had one daughter leading the armies and priests of Kemet, another who led the poets and politicians of Rome, and a population that worshipped him as the father of a goddess. But he had a growing problem with Psyche. Those who tried to marry her had tragic fates before they had a chance to marry. The first fiancé was a nomadic king with trade routes as far east as the Middle Kingdom and as far west as Hibernia. He was found suffocated beneath a ton of rose petals while in the desert. His kingdom, with no heir and no spouse, was left torn apart between warring generals. The next fiancé was the hero king of an island kingdom, whose steel was stronger than any in the known world, whose forges and blacksmiths would be the envy of any kingdom. Soon after his proposal to Psyche, though, he was found dead in his privy, molten iron poured into his mouth and permanently rooting him to the privy seat by passing through his body. Final fiancé, a great seer and rumored necromancer, a black blood prince of distant Adytum, took one look at his bride-to-be and told the court that Psyche was destined to be loved not by any mortal, but by a monster so fearsome that it only was discussed in hushed whispers by the gods. A monster so frightful that all of the damned denizens of the underworld shivered at the thought of this monster. A monster that had slain titans, a monster that had toppled heroes, and who stopped even heartless villains in their path. The king imagined a fearsome monster, a towering behemoth like Typhon, or a many-headed beast like Cerberus, or a venomous beast with poison so powerful it could kill an Olympian, like the Hydra, any of whom could easily destroy his entire kingdom. But the Adytum prince warned him it was even more fearsome. So he sent the seer away, and he asked for the oracle of Apollo. When the oracle arrived, he asked the oracle of Apollo what to do with Psyche. The oracle warned the king that if Psyche remained in the kingdom, that the kingdom would fall. He told the king to tell the kingdom that Psyche was dead, and to bring Psyche to the cliff, where she would be taken away by Zephyr, the west wind, to an isolated place, far beyond the kingdom, where the monster could take her away. The king, knowing better than to outsmart fate, told the kingdom that Psyche was dead, and he told Psyche of her new responsibilities to the kingdom. She would be taken away to be stolen by a fearsome monster. So the king had Psyche dressed in funerary clothes and took her to a distant cliff that overlooked her kingdom. From there she could watch her kingdom mourn her apparent death. Their wails were so great that she could hear it from her cliff. In time, though, their wails faded along with their grief. In time the kingdom grew quiet, and then it grew loud again with the people moving on with their day. Even with the death of the most beautiful princess, practically a goddess in her kingdom, in time their grief faded. And they moved on with their lives. Psyche could watch the world mourn her death and move on, something that a living person never gets to see, their own funeral and the world without them. From so far above over the kingdom, the world looked the same when it thought she lived, and it looked the same when it thought she died. Even if she was important to others, the world moves on without her, and up on her cliff she was alone for hours. She worried that this fearsome monster would strike her while she slept, so she stayed awake as long as she could. But as the night went on, Psyche's fear sapped her strength enough for her to fall asleep on the cliff. As she slept, she was picked up by Zephyr, the invisible western wind, who carried her off where she would meet her monster. Long before Psyche was taken to the cliff, Aphrodite saw that this kingdom had stopped worshipping her. She saw that they fell for Psyche, and she saw that they carved statues to resemble Psyche, not Aphrodite. She saw that their prayers were to Psyche and not to Aphrodite. Her pride was bruised, but she was careful to not directly interfere. Not yet, at least. Instead, she called forth one of her many sons, Eros, to cause Psyche to fall in love with something ugly or monstrous. Aphrodite's personal favorite punishment from mortals, from causing Persephone to lust for her husband's prized bull, to causing Polyphonte to lust after a bear, from causing great heroes to only desire attention of old women, to causing a hunter to fall in love with his reflection. Aphrodite's greatest gift was also her greatest curse, and her son Eros was her arrow. Still, though, as Eros flew invisibly through the air, he struck himself with one of his golden arrows, causing him to fall in love with the next person he saw, which was Psyche. As he fell in love with her, he promised he would protect her from all threats. So suitor after suitor, he slayed with both flour and iron, and when the seer from Adytum came to the court, he saw the invisible Eros, and it was Eros who he spoke to when he warned that Psyche would be taken by a monster so fearsome. Eros's love, though triggered by his arrows, was still true, so he promised to protect her, and he asked Zephyr to bring her to his palace when she fell asleep, before the monster had a chance to reach her. He was too love-struck to wonder who the monster could have been, but Eros would have stood before Hades, Nyx, and even Hera, or against any of the gods of Olympus, if it kept her safe. But as she was taken to his palace, he remained invisible, knowing that if she saw his true face, his true form, she would be driven mad. He loved her too much to let her go insane by seeing his true face, but he also loved her too much to let her go. When Psyche awoken, she was stunned by the beauty of the palace. She could see soaring columns, beautiful gardens, and countless statues of Aphrodite and Ares. Inside of the palace, there was a grand feast prepared in front of her, more food than she had ever seen in any palace. The food smelled even more delicious than she imagined food could be. She watched as the food was prepared, unaware it was invisible Eros preparing her feast. When the feast was ready to eat, she sat to eat, listening to music played on the lyre, also by Eros, still unseen by her. Her feast finished, she listened to the music before she grew bored, and she sought out more of the palace. She could see that there was many rooms, but only two looked ready to be slept in. The larger room had big windows and a view of the rolling hills around the palace, and the invisible force whispered to her, "This is your room, Psyche. Long as you stay here, this room is yours." She turned to where she heard the voice, but she still did not see her mysterious host. So she asked, "Who are you, my host?" she asked the invisible force. There was stirring in the air as the god thought about whether or not to be honest to her before he answered. "I am Eros, son of Aphrodite, son of Ares, named after my great uncle Eros, son of Nyx," he told her as Psyche thanked him. "Thank you for taking me away before I could be taken by a monster. Are there any rules I need to live by in this place?" "Is this place like the summer court?" she asked, referencing the fey courts of distant Hibernia. "I have only two rules. Do not enter my room after dark, and do not try to look upon my true face. My face is too much for any mortal to comprehend and remain sane," Eros warned her. Psyche thought about the rules and decided it would be easy to follow. She wasn't as versed in legends and stories as Thalia, but then she knew better than to betray a simple rule given by an Olympian. "Can you tell me where you stand so I can embrace you?" she asked Eros, who, instead of speaking with words, he responded with music, singing a song he learned from his cousin Apollo, a song Apollo once composed for a nymph who could never love him, a nymph that Eros cursed. If Eros understood the irony or the omen, he did not let it be known. He sang until Psyche embraced where he stood, her hands brushing his wings on his back, and it was the first step of Psyche falling in love with Eros. Across the weeks and months, Psyche watched as Zephyr would bring food and supplies to Eros's palace, and although Eros would vanish for many hours a day, he would return to Psyche, playing his lyre, serving her food, and servicing her. Usually invisible, except at night, where he would conceal himself in darkness. Psyche could imagine her lover and savior, and that was enough for her, at least for a while. Even at night, when he would ask her to cover her eyes with a blindfold, She could imagine how beautiful he was as he touched her, and they explored each other at night. She could feel no scars nor warts along his skin. She could feel how gentle and sensitive his fingers were. She could feel his calluses on his fingertips, on his ring finger, and on the inside of his index finger. She knew how silver-tongued he was when he spoke to her, and she could feel his tongue's flexibility on herself when he kissed both of her lips. When his arms tangled in hers, she could feel his strong but flexible muscles, the softness of his belly and chest when he touched her. She could run her fingers through his curly hair on his head and his smooth chin. Psyche had lain with many men and women in her kingdom, and she knew the dark made all beautiful in bed, but the darkness did not lend skill. But Eros clearly had loving skill. The way he knew how to tease her nerves, scratch her skin without leaving a mark, how to massage without squeezing, how to embrace without laying his weight on her, and how his feathery wings felt so downy and soft in her fingers, as she could hear his soft voice demanding dominance when his tongue and fingers entered, while he also meowed into her ears when his member invaded her. How he could be both soft and hard, caring and selfish, how he was both antithesis and synthesis. She could imagine him as anything or anyone, much like how she would when she cared for herself back in her kingdom. And she knew he did not care whomever or whatever she imagined, as long as he was the one who touched her, and she did not look at him. However, as loving as sex can be, it also often leads to another gift that not all are ready for. Psyche soon realized she was pregnant, and Eros was ecstatic with the news. But Psyche felt her thoughts plagued with how she would care for her newborn child. Would she have to raise them away from her family? Would her child never be able to see their father? Would she ever meet Eros's family? She knew he was the son of Aphrodite, but she did not know if Aphrodite would accept her grandchild. The Olympians were famously unwelcoming to new family members. So when Zephyr brought new supplies, she asked the invisible wind god to at least bring her sisters to the palace, so she could let her family know that she was alive and that she was pregnant. She also asked that Zephyr not tell Eros because she feared he would forbid the practice, but as long as she never asked, the practice could never be forbidden. Zephyr agreed reluctantly, but he also warned Psyche. I will not be held responsible for what Eros does, nor will I be held responsible for what you or your sisters do. In Argivia, love is rarely received without pain. In Argivia, a marriage with love is even scarcer. In Argivia, a loving marriage without pain is unheard of. When you love someone, it is like giving them a knife and telling them to press it to your skin, trusting them not to push it in. When you love someone, it is like trusting them with every poison in the apothecary and trusting them to make you a banquet. When you marry someone, it only ends in one of two ways, Zephyr said, the golden-haired god briefly visible to Psyche. Above his head, a rainbow halo, a gift from his wife. Divorce, he said, bathed in Iris's radiance. A wife he did not love, nor did she love him, but they did respect each other. Or death, Zephyr said, his radiant eyes glancing towards a cypress tree at the cliff's edge. At the roots of the tree were hyacinth flowers, stained purple and red, as Zephyr carefully touched the branches of the cypress, almost like he was caressing a lover. And Zephyr's breeze gently brushed past the hyacinth flowers, kissing and caressing each petal. They're my family. I love them. I want them to know about my pregnancy and my husband-to-be, Psyche told Zephyr, who sighed and turned back to Psyche once again, turning invisible, only his rainbow halo visible. Young mortal, little mortal, you're so naive. You only see comedy in your life. You only see the light of life. There is a reason my wife is only ever visible after rainfall. There is a reason Persephone can only see her husband in the underworld. There is a reason why beauty is kept locked away. I will carry them both to this place, and I will carry them from this place. But you will bear your consequences on your shoulders, and your shoulders alone, Zephyr said as he stepped from the cliff, both falling and flying to Psyche's sisters. Thalia at this time watched over her armies, stretched below her, farther than the horizon, an army so great that it pushed the sea people back into the deserts, and would soon pursue them deep into Asawa. As she watched the armies below her, she heard a voice whisper in her ears, "Step off this cliff. Your sister wants to see you. It won't hurt. I will carry you to a beautiful place in the sky. You will see Psyche again. All you have to do is trust me and step off this cliff," the voice whispered to Thalia, who refused to listen at first. But the voice was persistent. It would not leave her alone, not even to sleep. It just kept repeating its words, until finally, that night, Thalia, in her desperate moment, or a moment of weakness, depending on how you see it, stepped off the cliff that overlooked her resting armies. Few saw her that night, but all who did agreed she was carried off by the breeze. Cleo sat overlooking the central sea when she heard the voice in her ear. "Step off this cliff. Your sister wants to see you. It won't hurt. I will carry you to a beautiful place in the sky. You will see Psyche again. All you have to do is trust me and step off this cliff," the voice whispered to Cleo. At first, Cleo refused, but the voice followed her for days, and none dared approach her, for her eyes grew increasingly mad as she screamed about the voice that followed her, until finally, in her desperation, or her anger, depending on how you view it, ran off the cliff, eager to plunge into the sea. The city that watched her step off the cliff was amazed to see that she did not fall. When her sisters arrived at the palace at the same time, the sisters thought that they had died. When Psyche assured them that she was alive and showed them her growing belly, they accepted the fact that Psyche did live, and they were in a palace in the sky. They had their fun in the palace, feasting on food and wine alike. When Eros saw them, he was calm, cold to them. "You may stay the night, but tomorrow Zephyr will bring you both home. I can hide one mortal here, but three? I do not wish to tempt Zeus nor Aphrodite. But for now, enjoy the festivities," Eros said, invisible host for the women. As he played his lyre, they whispered to Psyche, "So you've never seen his face?" "No, never." "What if he is really ugly?" "What does it matter if he is invisible?" "What if he's a monster, like the Minotaur or a Gorgon?" "Oh, you know what I think? I think he's an Impusa. I bet he lays on her chest drinking her blood at night. I bet he impregnated her with a snake. Maybe a giant like Typhon." "He wouldn't do that to me," Psyche offered weakly, not wishing to show that her sister's words were having an impact on her and her fears. "Oracle said a monster that even the gods fear would fall in love with you. The gods fear Typhon, the gods fear Gorgons, the gods fear Impusa. You've never seen him," Cleo said as Thalia slipped something into Psyche's hand. "For protection," Thalia said, handing her sister an adamantine knife, a rock both sharp and hard enough to be able to slay a Gorgon. When he sleeps tonight, sneak into his room, see what he looks like, and if he's a monster, you can slay him, Cleo said it to her. And what if he isn't a monster? Psyche asked her sister. Then consider the knife and the lantern wedding gifts. Cleo told Psyche as they soon finished dinner and went to bed. While her sisters and fiancé slept, Psyche lit the lantern given to her by Cleo, and she carried Thalia's dagger to Eros's personal bedchambers. The low light of the lantern did not wake Eros, but let Psyche see him. He slept beneath his covers, his body covered. Beneath the covers she could see his wings, arms, and legs all twitch, his limbs making him appear more and more monstrous. She carefully lifted the sheet, slowly to avoid waking him. As she finally let her lantern's soft glow fall onto him, the first thing she noticed was his wings. They were a dark black, darker still than his great-uncle's Thanatos. His wings caught the soft light and reflected many colors between each feather catching the soft light and demanding that he be seen. His dark, curly hair cascaded down his cheeks and down to his shoulders, matching the stubble on his cheeks and chin. Did he shave himself every morning and every night just so she could touch him and kiss him without cutting herself on his stubble? She did not know any mortal man who would be so considerate. His eyes were closed, but his eyelashes and eyebrows were carefully plucked and as soft as the hair on his head. Cared for at a level of care that would have made even the royals of Rome jealous. His lips were soft, with a perfect Cupid's bow, and a soft pink that had a small amount of drool dripping from his lips to his pillows. He wore no clothes, and she could see across his body were tattoos of gold and silver, highlighting his dark skin. Tattoos of arrows, hearts, symbols of love, symbols of lust, symbols of anger, symbols of peace highlighted his skin. Psyche lowered her knife a little bit. Eros was handsome, but she did not understand what Eros meant by him being so beautiful that he would drive her mad. At least, she didn't realize until he opened his eyes. His eyes were not human eyes. They were not close to human. They were not close to mammalian eyes. They were not close to living eyes. The closest she could use to describe them would be the color. They were all one glowing color, like the color of every single drop of blood drained from every heart on the planet. Like the color of every single drop of love on the planet drained into the darkest ink. Like watching the most beautiful sunset at noon. He was very much not human. He was as divine as he was terrifying. "What are you doing?" Eros asked Psyche. "Kill him before he kills you," Psyche heard from her sisters' voices, standing directly behind her. When did they get here? She didn't ask. She didn't think. She only plunged the knife down into Eros's thigh, not quite where she was aiming, but he bled gold, the ichor of the gods. "Why are you hurting me?" Eros asked Psyche. His normally sexy voice now sounded weak, pathetic almost, like a scared cat. "Monster," Psyche heard her sisters say. But why was Psyche also saying it at the same time? "Oh, Zeus above, you saw my face. It's too much for any mortal, Psyche. You have to fight it. The madness inside you isn't you," the love god said as Psyche tried to stab him again. This time, her knife stabbed through his hand, the adamantine tip mere centimeters from his poisonous red eyes. You're going to kill me! You're going to kill our daughter! If I kill you first, I'll be free. Psyche said as she withdrew her blade, and she could see golden tears falling from her fiancé's eyes. His tears the same color as his blood. Or did Eros just cry tears of blood? I'm sorry, Psyche. You can't live here anymore, and neither can I, he said as he opened his wings wide, his wingspan nearly as wide as his room. You look beautiful, honey, Psyche said, her arms falling to her side, even as her sisters tried to pick up her arm. He's vulnerable. Cut out his liver. Eat it in front of him. Make Eros your bitch, Psyche heard from behind her, but she did not listen to the voices. She was instead fascinated by the wings in front of her. As he folded his wings and flapped them, causing a powerful breeze to push her out of the room and out of the palace. No, not a breeze, a zephyr. Why are you taking me away? Psyche whined to the god of the west wind. She was vaguely aware that her sisters were also being carried away, carried by Zephyr's breeze. I told you, this is your responsibility alone. You are lucky to be alive. Most who see a true form of a god are killed instantly. You are lucky to only be driven mad, Psyche. You nearly killed Eros. If you succeeded, both love and war would seek you out in every corner of the earth and below it as well, Zephyr told her. Why were we taken? Cleo asked, struggling in the grasp of the wind. Because you told me to kill him in his room, Psyche said. We weren't there with you, Thalia said. And as Psyche faced her sisters, she could also hear her sisters' words behind her. They're lying to you. We would never lie to you, the voices said, in her sisters' voices. They spoke also in her voice, in the voice of her parents, and even in the voice of Eros. It was like they were all behind her, their hands on her shoulders as she struggled. Madness, you said? Like from the Marquess? Psyche asked Zephyr, who shook his invisible head, although Psyche did not know how she could see his invisible form. It is. You see more, you hear more, you feel more, you understand more, and that is your curse. One of the many blessings, that of the human body, isn't what it reveals to the soul, it's how much it hides. How many invisible colors, how many silent sounds, how many scentless stinks, how many intangible touches, all hidden from the soul. But now you can sense more than you ever could before, some of which is there, some of which is not there. You have the sanity to understand insanity. You have the insanity to understand sanity. I am more sorry than you can ever know, but this burden is yours alone, Zephyr said as he let go of the three women on a distant Argivian shore, overlooking a cliff full of sharp stones. What happened? Her sisters asked Psyche, as she could only look off to the distant sea. She had many words she wanted to say, many thoughts she wanted to share, many sights she needed to see. But in that moment, all she could say, he was beautiful, Psyche told her sisters, who were confused, till Psyche explained how beautiful Eros was. It took many hours, and by that time she finished, dawn began to rise. The knowledge of what made Eros beautiful broke something in both Thalia and Cleo. But it wasn't like what happened in Psyche. Psyche had seen many magical and wonderful things in Eros's palace long before she saw Eros, so her mind was clay that was still wet. It could be deformed and dented, but it didn't break. Her sisters' minds were like clay that was already baked and cured. It didn't bend, it didn't dent, it shattered. They both stared into the sea as they whispered about how beautiful Eros was. He'll catch you. All you have to do is jump, Psyche whispered to her sisters, although she did not know why she did that. It just felt right. They were after the father of her child, and she knew there was only one way to keep them from ever threatening her chances with Eros. Eros? Eros, are you there? Thalia asked. Her memories of who she was before this day were gone. Her thoughts clouded with Psyche's words of how beautiful Eros was. Cleo wandered with her, both hand in hand, as they walked toward the cliff. Any thoughts on how it would work, or if there was any logic to it, was gone. All they cared was Eros was beautiful, and they thought he was there. Eros, where are you? Cleo called as Thalia pointed towards the rising sun. There he is. Can't you hear him? Thalia said as they took another step towards the cliff. Now just one step away from falling over the edge. They paused one last time. What if it isn't him? What if it's all an illusion and he isn't here? Cleo asked. Psyche yelled to her sisters. Then you can spend the rest of your lives wondering if he is just beyond the cliff's edge, rather than learning for yourself, Psyche said, her thoughts and words firm. Whether it was out of anger, jealousy, cold calculation, something that was new in herself, or something that was always there, Psyche did not know. She just knew that she wanted her sisters to step beyond the cliff. They held hands as they stepped over the cliff together. Neither Zephyr nor Eros caught them as they fell to the sea below. The only thing Psyche felt in that moment was the kick of her child still inside of her. As she turned from the sea, and she saw 3 temples in the distance, as she made her way to the nearest temple. The first temple, belonging to Demeter, goddess of agriculture, welcomed Psyche with open arms, giving her new clothes to wear, washing her feet and hands as she asked for a place to live. Priestesses welcomed Psyche that night as they prepared a feast, and Psyche offered to help in the feast. However, every piece of food that grew out of the ground rotted when Psyche stepped near. The wine turned too sour to drink, the olives were moldy, even the bread was as hard as stone. The only food that Psyche could touch without rotting was salt and flesh. So Psyche was asked to eat separate from the other priestesses, only eating the burnt flesh of pig that the priestesses reluctantly slaughtered for her. The next day, the head priestess told Psyche to leave the temple, that she was cursed, and that Demeter would not accept the princess. So Psyche, on her aching feet, traveled to the next temple. Temple for Hera, the goddess of motherhood. Psyche figured if anyone would accept her, it would be the mother goddess. And in Hera's temple, Psyche could eat freely without rot, and she figured that she was free of the curse. Until the sun went down and the other priestesses in the temple screamed in pain. all of them struck with violent pangs of childbirth, but none were pregnant, none were giving birth. They were filled with the pain without the joy of having a child. All of them Psyche had to care for the best she could. Warm rags and cold wine, but it eased little of the pain. By the time dawn's purifying light came to the temple, 3 of the priestesses died, just from the sheer pain. The head priestess told Psyche that she was cursed, and she couldn't stay in Hera's temple. So Psyche only had one temple she could go to, Temple of Aphrodite. The temple of Aphrodite was empty, save for a single woman in the center of the temple, covered in a long shroud like she was a married woman. There used to be people who came to this temple from all over Argivia. People would travel hundreds of leagues to leave their prayers and tributes in this temple. That was all taken away by a monster that injured my son. But I see a weary pregnant traveler, and I see that you are cursed. But I can tell you this, Princess Psyche, I know how to remove your curse, if you can handle my trials, the hidden woman said to Psyche. Tell me how to remove my curse, my lady, Psyche said as she bowed her head before the mysterious woman, kissing her feet as she listened to the woman speak. Your first challenge, if you want to eat tonight, is to sort these grains. Sort them from me, and I promise I will feed you tonight, she said to Psyche, as Psyche followed the woman. As she followed, she could hear the ancient echoes of this temple, prayers for beauty, prayers for love, prayers for marriage, familiar prayers that asked for one thing in the words, and in the tone, it asked for another. It was a lot like Eros. It was full of contradiction, but to Psyche in that moment, it was not a contradiction. It was just the way things worked. It was the cold so strong that it burned. It was the song composed of silence. It was the fruit so sweet it savored. It was what love was to Psyche when she was near Eros. But deep in the temple's cellar, far from the prayers, Psyche could see her task ahead of her. There were massive piles of grains mixed all over the floor. Piles taller than Psyche was, but not as tall as her hostess. Piles so wide that it stretched across the cellar, and so deep that Psyche had to wade through it. Grains of wheat, chaff, chickpeas, legumes, barley, and oats. Separate these piles into separate sacks before tonight, the host said, throwing 6 sacks at Psyche. But there's so much, and there is so little of me. How am I supposed to do this? She asked her hostess as she sighed. Anything in this cellar you can use to sort them. Place them in all of the sacks. If even one grain is misplaced, I will leave you out in the cold with no food, and you will never have your curse removed, the woman said as she stalked up the cellar steps, barricading the door behind her, making it clear that Psyche couldn't leave. Psyche tried to search the cellar for any tools, but if it had any, it was buried a long time ago under all of the grains. She tried separating the grains by hand, the low light forcing her to separate them all by touch. Even when hours passed, she barely put anything into the sacks. And the worst part? The way each grain would speak to her. Every single one had a voice, the same voice as the hostess, each one mocking her, calling her a murderer, telling her that she was forever cursed to stay away from Eros. They told her that she would starve in the wilds of Vargivia, her child cannibalizing her corpse and crawling out like Medusa's children. And these voices were heard with every single grain she picked up. And after many hours, she sat herself on the cellar steps, and she cried, hugging her stomach as she felt her starving stomach and her squirming child alike inside of her. Even after hours of her work, the piles of grain looked just as big as they were earlier. But she was convinced if she just didn't touch any of the grains, she would be free of the pain of the grain's voices. "Why do you cry?" a tiny voice said to Psyche. She turned to where the voice came from, and she could see a small ant on her finger. It must have wandered onto her hand, but as she held the ant, she could hear its soft voice. "I cry because there's so much work for me to do. I have to sort the grains before nightfall, but I cannot do it by myself," Psyche told the ant as the ant listened. After a moment of silence, the ant spoke. "In my colony, in my family, there is always lots of work to get done. There are tunnels to dig, food to sort, and children to raise. If any one ant tried to do it all, we would never get anything done. So we all do what little we can, and we get it all done. We can build colonies that would put your cities to shame. We can lift rocks that Heracles couldn't budge. We can even bring down titans. If you want, my colony and I can sort these grains for you, Psyche," the ant offered to Psyche. "But why would you do that for me? I'm not in your colony," Psyche asked. The ant, "I do it because it's what my colony wants to do. My colony does it because it's what I want to do. When you find your own colony, you will understand," the ant said as it marched off, and columns of ants swarmed the cellar. Psyche could hear the ants sing while the grain screamed. The ants carried each grain one at a time, sacks that filled with overflowing grain. No matter how much grain was put into the sacks, they never filled completely. So she watched as the ants finished, and the cellar was now empty, except for the 6 sacks with the grain. "Thank you, my friends," Psyche said to the ants. But now there were no voices from the marching insects. They retreated back to their homes beneath the dirt floor, leaving Psyche alone to realize that she may have not been speaking to the ants. But whether she was or not, the ants helped her, and just in time, as she had heard the barricade moved from the door, the shrouded woman stepped to the landing on top of the stairs. She swayed in place, a goblet of wine in one hand, and a crust of bread in the other. She slurred her words as she saw Psyche's hard work. "All sorted? How? Show me your hands," the woman said as she swayed down the stairs. When she got close, Psyche showed her hands, all covered in cuts and scrapes from the grains. It wasn't this bad when she asked the ants for help. It was almost like Psyche sorted the grain herself and not the ants. But that wasn't possible, was it? "So you did sort it. That's good for you. Here's your dinner," the woman said, dropping the crust of bread at Psyche's feet. Psyche desperately grabbed the bread and devoured it while the woman laughed. Little bitch. Congratulations on your first trial. Your next trial is to collect me some wool from Helios's sheep, enough to make my son a new tunic. His old tunic was ruined. If you hurry, you can get the wool before Helios wakes up at dawn, the woman said as she began to make her way up the stairs. I need sleep, please. I'm pregnant and I need rest for my child and I, Psyche begged the woman, who paused, only to turn to Psyche. Even though her face was covered, Psyche felt like the woman was staring daggers at her, her drunkenness gone in that moment and replaced by sobering anger. You need rest? My baby boy hasn't slept in days because he is in so much pain. He just finally passed out long enough for me to get some food and wine. This wool is to get him some clothes since all of his old clothes are covered in blood and shit. His blood and his shit. You don't know what it is like to watch your child torn apart by a monster. You don't know what it is like to watch your son make a mistake so stupid. If he would only listen. You're pregnant, so you want special treatment? You little bitch that came crawling to this temple asking for help. If you don't do this, your curse will carry to you and your child. If you really are going to be a good mother, you wouldn't ask another mother to make her son naked for your comfort, the woman said before she turned and stomped up the stairs of the cellar. Psyche sat in silence for a while longer before she began her trek up the stairs and out of the temple. She knew where Helios's sheep were, on the east side of the river. She grabbed shears from the temple as she made her way to the river, and where she saw the sheep with the golden wool rest on the small island in the middle of the river. The shores were guarded by thorny plants to keep anyone from harming Helios's sheep. As Psyche swam towards the island, you could hear the way the river babbled. It whispered of its journey from the sky to the mountains to the river, down to the sea. The river sang like a symphony, every drop a single note in the beautiful tone that pushed Psyche towards the island. As she reached the island, she swam beneath the thorns, careful not to prick herself as she crawled onto the grassy island. Helios's sheep slumbered peacefully as Psyche approached the sheep. The shears in her hands whispered to her, It'll be easy to slit the throats of the sheep. It'll be quick. It'll be painless. Surely Helios will not notice a missing sheep, the shears whispered to Psyche, but she resisted as a more prominent voice reminded her of the wrath of Helios had for those who harmed his livestock. The wrath of Helios would make a Spartan king seem merciful. So instead, she tried to shear the sheep's wool. But the shears could not cut the wool. The golden wool was harder than steel. Snip after desperate snip, Psyche could barely nick the wool. She couldn't even wake the sheep with her movements, because they were so protected by the wool. And every time she tried, the shears kept mocking her. You think this would be easy? You think the woman in black would be more merciful than Helios? You really thought that mortal shears could shear divine sheep. If you were smart, you would kill the sheep while Helios sleeps. You were never going to be a good mother for your child anyway. If you were merciful to your child, you'd take me to your own throat." The shears told Psyche, as in her desperation and anger she threw the shears into the water. As the metal drowned in the symphony of the river, Psyche once again hugged her stomach as she cried beneath the moonlit sky. Her tears mingled with the river and with her blood, and while she cried she got closer and closer to the thorns when she heard the thorns talk to her. "Why do you cry?" the thorns asked Psyche. "I cry because I need to collect wool from the sheep. My shears aren't sharp enough, and now I threw them away, and I have nothing to shear the sheep with," Psyche told the thorns. "If you need the wool of the sheep, you don't need to shear them," the thorns said to Psyche. "What do you mean?" Psyche asked as the voices of the thorns guided her to a spot where the thorns grew in a thicket on the island. In the thicket she could see many strands and threads of golden wool in the thorns, enough wool for at least 2 sheep. The sheep often get itchy while Helios is away. They use the thorns to scratch themselves, and when they do, they leave behind a little of their wool, and they have done it so often that they have left behind plenty of wool for you to collect. It doesn't matter if you cannot cut it. It's already been cut for you," Thorn said to Psyche. "Why would the sheep leave behind wool like this? Isn't the wool valuable?" Psyche asked the thorns. "The sheep love being scratched. When you love something, you leave some of yourself behind with what you love. And you bring some of what you love with you. The sheep leave behind their wool with us, and we leave some of our thorns with them as they take us with them. Sometimes it hurts to love something, but when you do, you leave some of yourself behind, and you take something with you, especially when it hurts," Thorns told her before they went silent again. And Psyche harvested the wool from her thorns. Each strand sang to her as she collected them and put them in her bag. As Psyche harvested the wool, she wondered again if the thorns really spoke to her, or if it was her mind, or maybe if it was Zephyr following her this entire time, telling her what she already knew, telling her something it saw before she could understand. She wondered if the world was really speaking to her, or if she was nothing special, and she hallucinated the voices that made her special. Psyche had no answer when far before dawn, as she swam back to Aphrodite's temple. As dawn arrived on her, the woman in black saw that Psyche carried the wool, enough for 2 sheep, as she inspected the wool and the wounded hands and feet of Psyche. "Your hands will callous eventually. Now you have another task, while I spin this wool into my son's new clothes. I need water from the Styx and the Coctius rivers of the underworld." "I cannot travel to the underworld just for water," Psyche told the woman who scoffed. "Lucky for you, there's a cliff nearby that has runoff from both waters. I just need an ampule of the water mix," the woman said, handing the ampule on a chain to the princess. "Be careful not to fall into the waters. You will be dragged to the underworld, and your curse will follow you, even as you wander the deepest pits of Tartarus," the woman warned Psyche as she turned away. "You need to rest," Psyche called up to the woman who sighed. "My son will not heal without this water, and you only have until noon before the sun dries out the water. If my son is not healed today, your curse will remain," the woman said as Psyche sighed again, and she began to trek to the cliff. the footprints leaving behind blood where she stepped, a legacy from the thorns on the island. The cliff, she could see the cave, down below, far down below. No way that she could climb it, no way she could hike down it. The pool on the bottom of the cave would be beyond her reach, and when the sun was directly overhead, it would evaporate the water below. How do I get down below? She asked. Step off the cliff. Fall into the pool. It's very easy. Rocks can do it, Cliff said to Psyche. I want to live, and I want to collect the water, she told the cliff. Why would I want a murderer to live? The cliff asked Psyche as she collapsed onto her knees, hugging her stomach. She was so tired, and she was so defeated. Her hands and feet were bloodied, and she had nothing left she could try and reach the bottom. There was nothing she could use to make a rope or ladder, and Psyche could not fly down. Sure, you can fly. All you have to do is flap your wings and let yourself float, the passing butterfly told Psyche, as she ignored the butterfly, its suggestion unhelpful to the mortal woman. As she sat there, her head in her hands, she noticed that there was an eagle standing nearby. It was watching her cry, and when she met its eye, the eagle spoke to her. Why do you cry? The eagle asked her. I'm crying because I need the water in the cave at the bottom of the cliff, but I cannot reach it, she told the eagle, who stared at her before it spoke. I dive to the cave on the bottom of the cliff all the time. It's the best place to get fish. If you wrap the chain around my neck, I can collect the water when I go hunting and bring it back to you, the eagle offered to Psyche. Why would you do that to me? The water is valuable to me, and you get nothing for it, Psyche asked the eagle. I don't get nothing. I get to hunt. The water is valueless to me, but invaluable to you. It costs me nothing to get it for you, but it gives you everything. The values of gods and mortals are not the values of fish and birds. The water is valuable to the fish because that's where it lives. The water is valuable to me because it's where I hunt. The water is valuable to you because it is where what is asked of you. The water is valuable to the gods because it can heal. We have different values with the same water. I will hunt with or without the water, but if it helps you, I will collect some water for you. And I hope you remember that even if something is valueless to you, it doesn't mean it won't have value to someone else, the eagle told Psyche as it flew below the cliff and soon returned with the ampule of water. Psyche carefully capped the ampule and thanked the eagle. The eagle did not speak, and Psyche wondered if she truly spoke with the eagle, or if she just believed she did, and she just wrapped the ampule around the neck of a random bird that she saw diving into the cave. As she traveled back to the temple, she did not decide what answer was more terrifying. She saw the woman in black again on the steps of the temple. When she offered the black water to the woman, she glanced at the ampule, and satisfied with it, she turned away, and she told Psyche her last challenge. I've been taking care of my son for so long. My beauty has faded, and I need to collect more of it. And there is only one place in the cosmos that beauty can be collected. From Persephone's collection in the underworld. You have until dusk to prepare. At dusk, the ferrymen arrives at the river, and then you will have until dawn to return. Prepare for the trip, Psyche. If you return, your curse will be lifted, the mysterious woman said. This time, Psyche did not bother telling the woman this was unfair. It didn't matter whether it was unfair or not. That was the way it is. As the woman entered her private chambers where her son recuperated, Psyche sat in the middle of the temple as she thought about traveling to the underworld. She hugged her stomach as she thought about how daunting it is to travel to the underworld, and as she thought about it, more tears fell from her eyes as this time the temple spoke directly to Psyche. "Why do you cry?" the temple asked Psyche. "I only have until dusk to prepare for a trip to the underworld, to collect beauty, but I don't know how to prepare to reach the underworld," she told the temple as the temple answered. "You can survive the trip, but you have to listen." As the temple explained how Psyche would survive the trip to the underworld. She listened, and she took the remaining hours in the day to prepare. When dusk arrived, the woman in black and the ferryman were already at the shore of the river when Psyche made her way there. "Are you ready for the trip to the underworld?" the woman in black asked Psyche, who nodded. "Good," she said as she turned away and made her way back to the temple. Psyche turned to the ferryman, who reached out a bony hand wordlessly, asking for something, as Psyche spat out a coin from her mouth onto his hand. Her hands filled with honey barley cakes, and the man nodded as he took the coin, and he pushed his boat into the underworld. Psyche was told that she would need to carry 2 coins in her mouth, one to let Charon carry her to the underworld, and the other coin to have him carry her back from the underworld. And she would need the honey barley cakes as another fare for another gatekeeper in the underworld. Sure enough, on the shores of the Styx sat Cerberus, the 3-headed guardian of Hades. As Psyche approached, the dog growled, and she did not need to hear its voice to know it was a threat. Still, Psyche laid both cakes in front of the dog, as the 3-headed dog began to tear into the cake, 2 heads eating while the third whimpered, letting her pass, now a friend to Cerberus. As Psyche traveled down the path to Hades' palace, she remembered the temple's warning. There would be distractions along the track. Beggars who would ask her for her very last coin, who would take away her only chance back to the Soulful Lands. Men with broken carts who would beg for her to help fix the carts, only to instead demand that she push the cart herself, chaining her to the cart because offering help meant the same as offering to do it all by herself to them. She was warned to avoid fear and terror, both twin sons of Aphrodite and Ares. Fear would give her an unpleasant feeling of danger. Terror would be the reveal of danger. She was also warned to avoid depression and anxiety, both handmaidens of Aphrodite, who would eagerly enslave Psyche, just like they had to so many other enemies and allies to Aphrodite. What the temple did not warn Psyche was that she should have expected was her sisters. Just beyond the trail, Psyche could hear her sisters' voices. "You said he was beautiful. You said he was beautiful. You said he was beautiful," he said as Psyche paused and turned her head to where she heard her sisters. And not far from the path, she could see a large couch built for royalty. Both Thalia and Cleo laying on the chest of a familiar man. They were wrapped by large dark wings, acting both as blanket and embrace. For a dark moment, Psyche thought she succeeded in killing Eros, confining him to the underworld, and now he fell in love with her sisters. After all, she recognized his wings and his chest, but as she watched him closely, she saw little details that were off. The calluses on his hands weren't on his index finger and ring finger, but on the inside of all of his fingers, like he held a sword, not a bow, and his head was hooded in a black cowl. But when the man's eyes peeked out to see her, he knew it wasn't Eros. Eros's eyes weren't like that. The stranger's eyes were very much not human. They were primal, like Eros's eyes, but the color was different, as dark purple as poison and as piercing as a freezing blizzard. His eyes were like the silence of a crowded place that heard the stranger's name, and while Psyche did not need to hear his voice, she knew the stranger's name. Thanatos, Eros's great uncle, that she could see they could practically be twins. But where Eros was warm, Thanatos was cold. Where Eros was terrifying, Thanatos was comforting. Where Eros was beautiful, Thanatos was awe-inspiring. And Psyche knew if Thanatos wanted her, he could just say one word and she would walk off the trail for him. That if he wanted her dead, he would take a single cut of her hair and he would follow her forever until she fell under his shadow. But despite that brief glance, Thanatos turned his eyes away from Psyche and to her sisters. Thanatos didn't need to worry about Psyche. It didn't matter if he went after her now or never. She would fall under his shadow and sword eventually, and she would spend eternity in the underworld alongside her sisters and so many others who fell for Thanatos' piercing eyes. Still, Psyche turned from that distraction, and with great strength she made step after agonizing step towards her goal, her feet screaming both in pain and in voices from her burden. She tried not to think about the fact that Thanatos made eye contact with Psyche and with the child she carried. So Psyche traveled the trail to Hades' palace, eyes forward and her coin under her tongue. Even if the beggars tried to pickpocket her, they would find no coins on her person. Even if the men with broken carts asked for her help, she kept moving so they would not have a chance to clasp irons around her. Even when wanderers tried to speak to her, her Psyche remained silent, so her coin would remain in her mouth the entire time. Finally, at the gates of Hades, Psyche could see Persephone, a woman dressed in both black and roses. Her dress was as sharp as it was beautiful. She saw Psyche, and she smiled. "Oh, are you here to collect the beauty?" Persephone asked, and Psyche nodded. "Give me just one moment, and you can have it," Persephone said as she disappeared into the palace, soon returning with a closed box that she carefully handed to Psyche. "Now remember, do not open the box. Beauty is too much for mortals to handle, and it may very well kill you if you look at it," Persephone told Psyche, who nodded as she turned, and she made her way back down the trail. Now, though, there was no distractions. as the spirits saw her carrying Persephone's box, and they veered away from her, too scared to get even close to beauty that was made by the Queen of the Dead. When Psyche made it to where Charon waited, he offered his hand to her again, and she spat out her final coin. He accepted the coin as they made their way across the Styx. As they traveled, Psyche looked at her own reflection in the Styx. This part of her trial seemed the easiest, even if it was travel to the underworld, and now she would be a hero remembered throughout time for being one of the only mortals to make it to the underworld and back. But then her reflection spoke to her again. Do you think you're beautiful anymore? Even if Eros forgave you, he would kill you if he saw you, the reflection said, and Psyche saw that her reflection was right. She had a scar on her face that turned ugly. Her eyes were exhausted, her lips were peeling, and her skin looked clammy. Her beauty was gone, but she did have beauty in her hands. Put it on you. Reclaim yourself. Surely you need it more than the woman in black, Psyche's reflection said to her. But Psyche kept the box closed, but her reflection kept pestering her. And it wasn't like the shears or the grains or the cliff. She couldn't leave her reflection behind, not while they were on the river. When they arrived, with plenty of time, Psyche waved at the ferryman as he left, and she turned to the temple and to the box in her hands. She figured it wouldn't hurt to take a peek at Beauty. She had seen Eros, and she was all right. The box agreed with her that she was not no worse for seeing Eros. So Psyche opened the box to view Beauty. It was like the sun shone into her mind. Psyche could barely close the box again as she fell forward, paralyzed, her body unfeeling and unmoving. It was too much, and now she was locked into her body. As she lay there, unable to move, she watched as the covered woman approached from the temple. She saw where Psyche lied, and for a moment, Psyche thought the woman was going to help. Instead, she took the box from Psyche's hands, and she opened it to confirm that Beauty was inside of the box. And with that confirmed, the woman turned away from Psyche as she walked to the temple, leaving pregnant, paralyzed Princess Psyche on the ground. There she lay all night, unable to move, unable to feel, barely able to think, as the voices of everything around her mocked her and her choices. But when dawn's purifying light came, someone unexpected appeared. From the temple steps, Eros walked, his body whole, his wound now a scar, as he wore a wool tunic made from golden fleece. He saw where Psyche laid as he ran towards her. I'm sorry, my love. I didn't know you were here. Not until my mother told me, he said, as Psyche realized that was who the woman in black was. She was Aphrodite, and she was the one who sent Psyche on these quests for the items to heal her son, Eros. I'm sorry, but this will hurt. I have to drain the beauty out of your body, like bleeding the venom from a bite, Eros said as he lifted a red arrow above his head and he stabbed it into Psyche's heart. As Psyche felt as each heartbeat pumped the beauty out of her body, each heartbeat more painful than the last, each breath more painful as she could feel again, and beauty lie below her body, red like blood from a wound. And as the beauty weakened, so too did her baby. The baby, Psyche whimpered to Eros, who nodded, as he pulled a flask from his side and he offered it to her. Nectar of the gods. It'll make you and the baby immortal. Drink up, my love, Eros said, as Psyche, in her desperation, drank the golden nectar of the gods. The drink sweeter than honey and warmer than wine, as her body healed, and the blood beneath her body slowly turned from red to gold. And she could feel changes in her body as her own wings grew from her back. Large, colorful butterfly wings that warmed Psyche just by touching them. They're beautiful, Psyche said as the wings spoke to her. Thank you. We were inside you this entire time, the wings whispered to her. As she glanced up to Eros in his eyes, and Psyche realized she could see his eyes without losing more of her mind. He kissed her, and she kissed him. Two immortals now embracing, with another immortal child on the way. Eros took Psyche far from where the Olympians could find her, at least until she gave birth to Hedone, goddess of pleasure. But with their child born, Eros announced to the Olympians that he had found a wife. His mother, Aphrodite, danced at their wedding, not noticing that Psyche, the goddess, was once Psyche the mortal. Aphrodite could not recognize Psyche's face, not with all of the beauty bled away. She could not notice the goddess's hands and feet, now permanently scarred from her tasks, to help heal her husband. She could not notice how different Psyche was from the princess who once demanded prayers and tributes, from the goddess of the human mind and the human soul. Whether Psyche would have recognized herself if she saw the princess all of those years ago, it did not matter in her wedding. She was immortal, she was married, she was in love, and she had a child. It did not matter if the woman across from her once tried to hurt her. Aphrodite was not just the one who cursed Psyche, she was also the one who danced at Psyche's wedding. If Aphrodite could be the mother of fear and terror, she could also be the mother of harmony and avenging. If Psyche could be the one who murdered her sisters, she could also be the one who went to hell and back to save her husband. And if Psyche learned anything from her journey from a human to a god, is that all things were full of contradictions, and by accepting all of their contradictions, you could understand why they cried.